start with a slightly cynical response that the answer is no, it can't. However, I'll qualify that slightly in the sense of saying that yes, in certain, and there are many, I think, contexts we can point to where sport has been used, and there are attempts to use sport to draw together societies that are divided, whether on the basis of national identity, ethnicity, or some other form of, if you like, sort of social fractures. And there are many useful and I think quite worthy examples of where sport can be used in that way. However, if you look at it the other way around, sport is quite often used as a mechanism, as a vehicle, to actually, if you like, reflect divisions within society and possibly even to amplify those divisions. And you can see that through perhaps particular national rivalries in international sporting competitions and in a sort of a variety of ways. So I think, to my mind, it's not necessarily the question we should be asking. I think we can accept that sport can be used for good or for ill, and it can accentuate division, perhaps rather more readily than it can sort of draw a nation together. It has that potential, but it can, as they reinforce. So that's one issue to do with the sort of the sporting dimension of the question. The other part of the question, in a sense, is unifying a divided nation. But in somewhere particularly like the UK, that begs the very serious question as to which nation we're talking about. This is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We can define it as it is a state, which is a political entity or a set of political institutions that contains within it a number of what we might argue are separate and distinct nations. So we can think in terms of the English, the Welsh, the Scottish, the Irish, or perhaps more narrowly the Northern Irish, together with a whole series of other ethno-national identities linked to people's family background, ancestry, and so forth. So there's a quite serious set of questions about what nation we're actually talking about here. Trying to link all this to Brexit, I think, is quite difficult, and how sort of what the implications of Brexit for sport might be and so forth. But just, I suppose I'll limit myself just to a couple of quick comments. In terms of professional sport, in recent years, recent decades, we can argue that we've seen a sort of, I suppose, if you want to put it this way, I suppose a multinationalisation of certain sports. Football, the sport that I'm most interested in, you can kind of see that in two ways. If you look at something like the FA Premier League and the lower leagues of the structure, you've got football teams that are increasingly composed of sort of players drawn from a range of countries, not just European countries, but much more globally. You can argue, what's the impact of that? Well, on the one side, people will argue that it detaches clubs in some ways from their immediate locality. Clubs are place-based, and their fan base is largely, though certainly by no means exclusively, local or regional. But those who perform for those clubs are drawn from a whole range of backgrounds, and you'll obviously be aware there's different attitudes to that. In some ways, we can see that in very positive terms of giving people a sense of other parts of the world, and whereby their, in a sense, local heroes may come from somewhere else. We can argue that that potentially plays a role in greater understanding and in a sense of a sort of a greater sense of international belonging, for want of a better way of putting it. Other reactions to that are seen in more negative terms, in terms of its negative impact on young local talent and so forth, and as I've already said, in terms of detaching the club from its local moorings, if you like. There's also a question you can ask about whether withdrawal from the EU will have an impact upon the Premier League. Will it make it a less attractive place for players to come to? Will it make it more difficult for players to come to, etc.? That depends by and large on football's regulatory regulations as much as it does upon membership of the EU, but we don't quite know how that will pan out. The second point I wanted to make in relation to things I've looked at in research is the increasingly multinational nature of some international representative teams, again, particularly in football. I'm from the Republic of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland's team for the last 3 decades has been composed of a significant number of players who have a connection to Ireland through family, but not through birth or residency. They are the sons or grandsons of Irish immigrants. You can see this mirrored, not so much in football in an English context, though to an extent, but more so perhaps through rugby and through cricket in terms of drawing players from other places. What that the implications of that are, for some, again, this reflects a more sort of a wider sense of the nation, a wider sense of identity as more all-encompassing. For others, the reaction is to retreat into a sense of, well, no, these people they're not of the nation, they're other. And you do see these sort of polar arguments. On the one hand, a more, what I would regard as a more outward-looking, positive sense of the nation through its migrant connections, and on the other hand, a more insular, inward-looking one that is defining who can be a member of the nation in much more narrowly rigid terms, as you must be born and brought up here to be adopted as a member of the nation. Quite where all that leaves us in relation to Brexit, I'm not sure. My final point would be, I suppose I worry a little bit, more than a little bit, that Brexit in itself, or at least one key strand of the Brexit debate, mirrors a retreat into a more insular versions of nationalism, and that bothers me.
David, thank you. Wonderful. Second, let me introduce you to Dr. Jozo Molnar, Principal Lecturer in Sport Studies, and in particular in sociology. Jozo's expertise surrounds migration, interests in globalisation, identity, and particularly in empowering marginalised populations. Jozo, tell us a bit more.
Thank you very much, Don. Yes, my research in particular has been revolving around exploring the relationships between sport and politics, in particular in countries which would be termed as post-colonial or post-communist. And one of the latest work which I've been working on kind of looks into the nation-building tendencies sport has displayed through certain regimes, in particular populist politics. And so, based on that knowledge, I have been thinking about the question which is the focus of this panel. And similar to what Dave said, and I would have to agree, and then you kind of touched upon a lot of things I was going to mention. So I might be a little bit repetitive. But our general response to the question would be, no, I don't think that sport is capable of uniting a nation. But I'm also not sure if this is actually the right question to ask. What I'm thinking about in terms of asking the question is, can anything, any institution similar to sport or any kind of feature of modern or late modern Western culture can unite a nation? And again, my answer to that one would be no, I don't think so. We live in nations which are, for various reasons, divided. And it's not necessarily a qualitative judgment on sport that sport cannot do that unification process, because I don't think that anything else would be able to actually unite a nation. I mean, what's happening at the moment in terms of Brexit, and that the nation, or nations, as David pointed out, or countries being divided, it's because of various opinions, various fears, and of course, sport, I agree, it is for a lot of people, or some people, part of their identity, and it's something which they hold very dear. But again, I would agree with what Dave said, that sometimes sports can also create tensions, not necessarily just build tensions. And this is something which I have seen over time in many different political regimes which try to use sport, in particular football and other team sports as well, to unify nations. And in most cases, as far as I can see, and I have seen the evidence in various different countries, that they backfired after a certain amount of time. Communist regimes using sports, post-colonial regimes using sports, and after a while, especially when the sport itself is unsuccessful or people disagree with sport-related investments coming out of the government's budget, then created a lot of tension. So my answer to the question would be no, I don't think that sports would be the appropriate institution to unify the nations, but that's not necessarily a weakness of sport.
Thank you very much. Thirdly, let me introduce you to Dr. Rachel Billingham, Senior Lecturer in Physical Education. Rachel's particular expertise surrounds homophobia and various research studies in that, under the broader banner, I think, of trying to help make sport a more inclusive place to be. Rachel, tell us a bit more.
Thanks, Don. So it's quite interesting going after Dave and Jozo, because they're much more looking at things from a kind of like high perspective, if you like, much broader in terms of nations and nation states and how sport can be used to either unite or divide, however they want to look at it. But my research is much more looking at the individual, so kind of much more about the individual rather than the bigger structure that we go within. In relation to the question, I think, and in relation to Brexit, I think we were talking about it this week, and for me it's the impact on the individual in terms of things becoming polarised. So if we think about the question, can sport unite a divided nation, I would agree with both Dave and Yoza and say no, it can't. But I think that we need to actually consider things in a much more kind of dynamic way, in that we are creating a polarised society in Brexit and the way things are. Now within that has meant that hate crime has increased for a broad proportion of society, of people that are othered, as Dave said. And that they're the people that I look at, the people that are othered. And the way that politics are at the minute, and particularly the night before last when the government came back into session, the language that was being used and the rhetoric that was kind of going on in Parliament suggested that things are more divided than ever. And that is going to mean that people who don't fit into that social norm of either polarised point is going to be othered. And therefore, I agree with Yoza that sport can't help bring people back together, but then I'm not sure what can either. And I don't think we should have an expectation that sport can be the kind of thing that it's like, oh, it's okay because we won the World Cup. That doesn't work, that premise doesn't work. Not to mention the fact we won the World Cup, as Dave said, with an Irish captain, and the guy hitting the winning runs was born in New Zealand. It's when we start to think and break things down a little bit, it's kind of a bit more complex than that. And I agree that the question is perhaps somewhat simplistic in terms of the current climate that we're in and the dynamic of both politics and sport. And whilst the Olympics can be a celebratory event, sport in itself is exclusionary, really, and that inclusive nature is something that perhaps is in the utopian world rather than in reality.
Rachel, thank you very much. So finally, let's turn to Dr. Andy Kale, Head of Department in the School of Sport and Exercise Science. Andy has an extensive experience in both coaching and coach education and a PhD in sports psychology. So matters of identity, surely a good person to turn to. Andy, tell us what you're thinking.
Thank you. What am I thinking? I'm really confused. The question is a difficult one. These esteemed academics are really good at what they do. They have lenses, they have sociological looks at things and structures, but I'm a simple coach. I don't operate at their level. I operate with kids. I operate with people playing the game. I operate with people enjoying fun. And do I think sport can play the role of a united vehicle? Yes, absolutely. Because if we can't believe sport can, what vehicle can? So I've been very fortunate in my coaching life. I managed to be an assistant coach for England junior teams over 250 times. And what did I see? I saw young people growing and developing and having real pride in their nation. It was giving them a belief, a self-esteem, a social identity. So one of the problems I have with this debate is, what is identity? And my colleagues have identified it in one way, but I identify it in a completely different. From a sort of psychological background or psychosocial background, I think sport can be very, very powerful to deliver kids fun, to deliver physical activity outcomes, mental health outcomes, social and economic outcomes. So I'm much more positive than some of my colleagues, but I understand their reservations. They quite rightly say, and the research is quite rightly conflicted. I think the sport is part of the problem, but part of the solution. So it depends on what you're looking at and where you're coming from. I'm very much, this glass is half full. I think sport can be a vehicle of uniting the nation. I came past my house the other day and West Worcester youth were playing, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds. I don't see social, political structures going on when I watch them. What I see is running about, they're playing, their parents, the kids. It is developing personal skills. It is developing their own individual identities. So Rachel talked about individuals or structural identities. I'm at the coalface a little bit. I want to believe that sport can be this vehicle. And I do see people growing through sport. And I happened to coach in Wales. And I loved coaching in Wales. And that enabled me to understand slightly different cultures. I've coached for England. And I like Munster. And I have a belief in the identity of some of the Irish and values of sport can bring. So I have some other arguments that we can go on to, but as you've guessed, I'm at the other end of the argument here. I think, yes, sport can play a part in dividing our nation, and I think we all are part of the solution, not the problem.
Andy, thank you. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of things that Andy said, and I'm going to put these back to the panel, and I'm just going to add one little thing to that. Give me a little nod in the audience if you've watched the film Invictus. True story. So in one of the most divided nations on earth at that time, Nelson Mandela dons a Springbok jersey and walks out into the World Cup and onto the Rugby World Cup field. And the contention is from that film that that was a major part in bringing together and uniting that nation. So I'll put this to Rachel first. That's not utopian, is it? That was a very real example of sport uniting that nation, wasn't it?
Somebody don't.
It united certain parts of that nation, but it certainly didn't unite the nation. I mean, you only have to look at South African politics now to know that how divided a nation it is, and it's still having significant issues from its history. You know, the recent election that was in South Africa was very contentious. There were the party lines are still split on race. You know, the ANC is one party that is for one section of the population, and then the other section of the population has a lot of parties that span the political divide. And within that election, it showed the fact that there is still significant divide within the nation, but also between different provinces. So you could argue that in Cape Town, where things are much more, things are going more to plan, and there's the economy is strong. Things are much more settled. But you go outside Cape Town, you go to other parts of the country, and things are still very divided, and they are divided on racial lines. The country is not very prosperous in terms of economy. Parts of the country still have to have 2 hours a day where they don't have electricity. You know, there are still a lot of issues there, and to see that one moment as kind of, oh, cool, job done, we've ticked that box, we've fixed the nation by winning the Rugby World Cup, is perhaps naive, and the recent election showed that it's still a very divided nation.
Thank you. If I ask Yozo a similar question, but add to that, given your extensive research in Antipodean culture, surely you recognise the importance of rugby and rugby union in New Zealand and Fiji and those kind of countries as bringing a nation together?
Yeah, well, it is an interesting question, and to some extent, similar to what Rachel said, there is some potential to bring some parts of the nation together, but specifically with my research in Fijian society, rugby is very much associated with dominant groups, and a particular dominant group which is male Fijian, indigenous Fijian rugby players. And so if you are not part of that group, then you get marginalized. So as much as it's bringing the already dominant group or groups together, it also marginalizes anyone else who is not part of the group. So other aspects of my research also looked at women's and Indo-Fijians and their relation to rugby and sports in general. And the general consensus is that they felt and they feel marginalized. Not to mention individuals who, again, non-normative in terms of their sexual orientation, in terms of the general perceptions, and they're not accepted in that particular nation. And it kind of goes back to one of the things which I was going to say at the beginning, but I forgot about. It's just how to define a nation and who belongs to that nation. And again, it comes back to what Rachel said about the nation is being polarized, but at the same time, through various discourses, they're trying to bring it together, which unifies, but also excludes, or has the tendency to exclude individuals who are not part of the dominant group. And that creates a lot of issues and tensions for individuals who would be on the margins, generally, who are not part of the nation, because the definition of a nation is something which changes over time. I remember when I moved to the UK ages ago, it was Cool Britannia, it was multicultural society, and very strong Labour government, which was kind of celebrating the multiculturalism. That era is pretty much gone. And it's a completely different perspective now, where you say that the hate crime is something you can see is increasing, and you got police reports which say that very clearly. Not to mention again what Rachel said regarding the language in Parliament and how that's affecting the general public, where there are individuals who are supposed to be your role models and look up to them, and at the same time they are fighting like what you would normally see somewhere else, not necessarily in Parliament. So yes, to answer your questions, it does have, and I kind of stand by that when I said at the beginning, there is the potential for sport to be used for good and for unification, but at the same time there are also quite a lot of drawbacks. So again, I don't think that this is like the silver bullet in terms of sorting out all the problems that we have at the moment, and I don't think it is capable of, it's not just sports, I don't think anything is capable of uniting a nation.
David, I'll come to you in a second, but I want to go back to Rachel just at this point, because Yozo brought out specifically there the nature of dominant groups in society. And Rachel, given your experience, particularly in the field of homophobia and research in that area at the moment, surely sport is a mechanism for good in terms of bringing equality issues to bear. I'm thinking the recent coverage of Gareth Thomas, for example, is a key example, isn't it?
Well, I mean, Gareth Thomas's example was positive, and he has had very positive coverage, but you need to watch Megan Rapinoe's speech from winning Best Female Footballer of the Year, that happened on Monday in Milan, I think, was it Milan? In Milan, and she said that she's been most inspired this year by Raheem Sterling and other footballers who had faced an inordinate amount of racism. She also described homophobia in football as extensive. I'm not sure I'd agree with her on the level that she's talking about, but she says it's extensive and very evident when she's, for not only her but also male players. And she said that actually it's not just the people who are affected by this that need to speak out, it's the allies, if you like, of the different marginalised groups that need to stand up and start speaking for people like Raheem Sterling, who is receiving a lot of racism at the moment, and there is quite a lot going on within football. But she was saying that that's just not happening. That allyship outside other groups isn't happening, and she was talking from her own experiences in football and suggesting that actually it is still the people. She is the one talking about women's football needing more financial support, and they're still in a pay dispute. The American players are still in a pay dispute about equal pay. So I would disagree that sport is doing that, because she distinctly highlighted that the lack of allies outside those other groups is showing that actually the dominant group is still impacting other people negatively.
David, what do you think of what you've heard of the last one?
So far.
Can I leave now? No. A few things. I mean, I'm not entirely disagreeing with what Andy's saying here. I do think there is that potential here, and in many respects, I'm kind of heartened that Andy has that belief and that enthusiasm and engages at that level, because to my mind, that is a good thing. That's what, as I'm going to use an awful term, socially responsible citizens or something like that, whatever we might see ourselves as. If we see our role, whether as students or as academics or as sports coaches, as somehow, in some sense, progressive, whatever we mean by that term, you work where you are, and whether that be with coaching kids or through sport at an amateur or professional level, you do what you can. But I would agree with, I think it was Rachel said a few minutes ago, that at the same time puts enormous pressure on sport to become the vehicle that somehow solves a much wider set of what are ultimately structural problems within society. So I don't disagree, but I simply don't, I'm more cynical about it, I suppose, and I think in the sense that sport then equally becomes a device to be used to support particularly narrow views of the nation, as Joseph said, and so forth. Your earlier question in relation to Nelson Mandela and the South African rugby team in '95, I agree with Rachel in the sense that we shouldn't get sort of misty-eyed that somehow this was a turning point in South African politics, and it's not just to do with racial divisions, to do with class divides and so forth. And it's not as though somehow that resolved South Africa's issues. It certainly didn't. I would partially agree, though there was an enormous symbolism attached to that, and we shouldn't reject the symbolism of that. And there is a symbolism, I suppose, around Gareth Thomas, for example, and so forth, Megan Rapinoe, and so forth, that I wouldn't want to underestimate that, but equally don't get carried away that somehow, hey, hang on, this is a turning point. They may be staging posts that take us somewhere else, but they don't necessarily. They can easily be forgotten and you can revert back. If you talk about unifying the nation, London Olympics 2012, now I'm totally cynical about the way that was marketed and presented, but part of that was bound up, and they did do good things. You can argue in terms of its impact directly on some sports, and perhaps at a community level. It may well have had positive impacts. But that sort of feel-good factor uniting the nation, where the hell has all that gone? It's disappeared completely, as I think it inevitably was bound to do. So, yes, we need these symbols. I think they are important, and I don't think we should be totally cynical about the work that is done, particularly at a grassroots level, and sort of fostering in various contexts cross-community support, and even going down to health benefits and all sorts of notions. But let's not get carried away that sport in and of itself is going to solve society's problems, and in a number of instances it can simply amplify and exacerbate.
Can simply amplify and exacerbate. And I'm going to come to some of you guys in the audience for any questions you might have in a minute. But Andy, let me put that point to you. And also, just in the context of you as a junior international football coach, selecting and developing England junior teams, aren't you then part of the problem of exacerbating the divide between nations? Isn't that the essence of competition, essentially? It's England versus the world, isn't it?
I thought you were on my side. Sport by its nature is competitive, and it brings challenges. But that's why people who play sport thrive within those challenges. It is about winning, it is about developing, it is about participation, it's about all of those things. And it doesn't have to be negative. It can be negative, and it can be perceived as negative. And in the wrong hands and in the wrong structures and with wrong investments, groups can be marginalised. But flip that. In the right place, in the right hands, with the right investment, I still believe sport can be a vehicle for generating some form of togetherness and unitedness. It is not the one thing that is going to give us that way, but it is something. And so I have no problem in selecting X number of elite players to go forward and X number of other really, really talented kids to still enjoy the game, because that's the nature of sport. It is elitist by the nature of winning and a league table and becoming an international or winning international games. But at the same time, within football context, you can see under 8s and under 9s and under 10s forgetting what the score is. Of course there's a winner and a loser, but that's not how the kids relate to the game. Sometimes it's not how the parents relate to the game. So in relation to lots of the comments, I am heartened by my colleagues in terms of sport can be a vehicle. It can be. I don't think they've said it can't be. They just said there are problems and challenges. Absolutely. But I think done correctly, and if you look at the context of the UK and the UK sport policies that we're trying to promote, and where coaches and teachers are within that policy, coaching is changing. I think the role of a PE teacher is changing, and we are being charged with something that is very responsible for the citizens. We've been charged with mental and physical well-being, social and economic development. Wow, hold on, that's not what I was trained for. But the state or the policies are saying, no, we need help with this, and we think sport is a very good vehicle to deliver those outcomes, and I think we can. Do we need help and support and training and work at it? Yes, but it has the potential. So problems, yes, challenges, yes, but we can be part of the solution.
Okay. Let me turn to you. I've got a couple of questions that have come in online, but has anybody in the room got a question they'd like to ask the panel?
That young man at the back.
Nick Connell from the School of Sport and Exercise Science. Just picking up on the marginalisation point, I think at times that does happen, but I wonder how the panel would respond to the fact that in the recent Cricket World Cup, obviously the Football World Cup, we broke all viewing records for people who wouldn't normally be interested in the sport, wanted to cheer the team on and engage, and different social groups came together, and that was just in the UK. So clearly that's happening all around the world. So I'd argue that at times sport's a very powerful tool, and I know lots of people now are in love with cricket, and before they didn't know the difference between a bat and a ball. So what does the panel feel about that?
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody like to go first?
I agree with you, mate.
Yozo, tell us what you think.
So in terms of elite sports, I think that is by nature exclusive. And yes, there are certain groups, as I said before, which would be benefiting from it. But to be more exclusive, I don't think that that's something which you can do with elite sports. Yes, you can spread the culture which is associated with sports, which has been happening for a very long time. We sometimes forget that sports, especially modern sports, they are Western inventions, and they are popular and popular across the globe because of colonizations. When colonizations were taking place, the colonizing masters were taking the sports with them, and they were essentially, directly or indirectly forcing them onto local communities and nations and tribes. So, and then some of those countries, like my research in some of the South Pacific island nations, they took to the sports and they started developing it, and then kind of incorporated into their cultural markers and cultural identity. But again, in most of the cases I looked at, it was always part of the dominant groups, the dominant populations, individuals who already were in power. So essentially sports accentuated the powerful position and didn't necessarily help individuals who were in marginalized situations. On the other hand, there are some examples where sport would be offering some kind of a space for resistance as well. So one of the things, if we're kind of linking this back to some of the mega events, which Mick mentioned, not necessarily the World Cup, but the Olympic Games. So we know that 1968 is a very important year for the Olympics in terms of using the Olympic platform for the Black Power salute, where you can resist, where you can actually try to use the sport and the audience which sport gathers to display a very specific message, which Tommy Smith and John Carlos tried to do with the Black Power salute. But then if you look at the reaction of the IOC to that, which was then kind of saying, oh, well, the Olympic Games and sports are not political, so they were sent home from the Olympic Village. So you try to resist, but then there is the status quo, which again oppresses you back and reacts and kind of stops that. So again, kind of similar to what Andy said, the platform of sport can be used for good and also for ill, can actually help resist, but at the same time it can also be used for oppression. So I think what to me is important is who is going to make the decision what's incorporated into sports, what values we are teaching, what's good, what's not good. And that goes back to the actual definition and question about what we mean by a nation. How we decide, who can belong to a nation and what kind of values we hold dear or cherish in that particular nation. Because these are the values which we're going to be potentially teaching through sports. So these are the things I think we probably need to answer in order to fully understand the picture. I'm not sure if it was an exact answer to the question, but kind of in a roundabout
You make
way.
your own question up.
Well,
I'm
so
sociologist after, so I can do that.
let's thank you. So we'll just add some mixed question in reminding the panel of what happened in the wake of the Rio Olympics 2016. My sport, women's field hockey, won the gold medal, and since then we have had more underrepresented groups, and I'm talking women, people with disabilities, participating in hockey in a sustained way for the last 3.5 years. Isn't this yet further evidence, as Mick suggests, that actually sport can be an incredible, powerful factor?
You've added to the question. I was going to answer that, but that's okay. Okay, I see where Mick's coming from. I don't really know enough about cricket probably to make a meaningful response, other than a more general one, which I think is probably along the lines of what Joseph just said. But yes, it can have a number of positive impacts. I just think it depends on how it plays out. And also you need to think about it longer term rather than just, the impact figures in terms of viewership and the uptake of the sport amongst different groups and so forth. And I take on board exactly what Don said. It can have that effect. I think you do need to judge it in the longer term. I think you need to look at how it plays out in all sorts of ways. One comment on cricket. Ireland does not have a great cricketing tradition, but did, 12 months ago or so, become a test cricketing nation. They're still shit, by the way, but never mind. But there was an interesting contention of the fact that Owen Morgan, we referred to this earlier on, was the captain of the England Cricket World Cup winning team. The reaction to that in Ireland is kind of strangely ambiguous. It has produced a kind of, well, we're not interested in cricket reaction among some people. It's led to slight, not particularly vindictive allegations of him being a traitor, but and so forth. But it also has made, there's some evidence of an uptake in cricket in Ireland and kids in playing cricket because of the effect that Morgan has had. So I think that you can argue it is positive in all sorts of things. Where I was going with this earlier on was kind of the way where you do get certain moments where you can see something that is, to my mind, sort of positive. I think I'm right in saying Everton fans recently, following the signing of Moise Keane from Inter Milan, the player had been subject to racist abuse at a number of Italian games, and Everton fans have got together to have a welcome Moise Keane anti-racism banner present at their next or last home game or whatever. Yeah, I can see there's a certain symbolism that it's sending out a message. And years ago, when Peter Adamwingi, the Nigerian international, moved from, I think it was Lokomotiv Moscow to West Brom, he'd been the subject of monkey chants in Moscow, and West Brom fans produced a banner saying, "You're welcome here, thank you Spartak," or Lokomotiv. And you can see those sort of moments where there is a sort of a potential, or there's, in my view, quite a positive reaction. But those moments can instantly disappear as well, and can be lost amongst a kind of the recent rise that I think Rachel's referred to in certainly racist and to some extent certainly homophobic abuse of particular footballers and athletes and elsewhere. So it doesn't we can't just look at it in terms of simply, hey, this is great, it has a positive impact. It might do, and some of those impacts are positive. Some of them may play out in a rather different way further down the line.
I'll turn to the final two panel members, maybe with that question, but if there's one more question from the floor, we could ask that now.
Am I the only one?
I think so.
All right.
Yeah, there you are.
Thank you for your insight. We've got a room full of coaches and potential teachers who will be teaching marginalised groups through sport. Is there any advice that you would offer them to sort of say, can they make a difference? And should they be able to make a difference? And if so, how? I mean, I know that's 3 questions in one. What would your advice or words of wisdom be?
And your name is?
You keep going with your notes.
Rebecca Foster. Can I just read you an item hot off the press? You may not have had it. Email from Rebecca Foster. Yesterday I attended Youth Sport Trust, Learning Academy Day, interesting account of the changing landscape of young people in sport and PE. Chief Executive believes sport and PE has the power to combat the growing trend of childhood anxiety and stress, and how important the role of sport and PE is for the future. So in answer to your question and your recent email, I think these people are in a fantastic position to be able to challenge some of the concerns and worries of the nation, not the complete solution, but trained properly, with the right knowledge, giving them the right morals, giving them the right information, we can make a difference. And that's all we can do. We can only be the best teachers, coaches, academics we can be to help support. And we are positioned extremely well to empower our undergraduates to develop sport for the nation. That was your own words. What a great question.
I'm going to ask for one last opinion from Rachel, perhaps directly on the back of that as an experienced PE teacher, and maybe you'd like to sort of close our panel with your final thoughts on Bex's question.
Yeah, I think there is an opportunity, and like we've said, you know, the three of us answered the question that no, it can't unite a nation, but that at the same time there can be those snapshots of positivity. So I think that it's using that platform to be able to lead change and make a difference. You know, sport in itself is exclusionary, so maybe think broader in terms of physical activity, exercise and health. You know, I think we would all agree that the question talking about sport bringing together, you know, the unity, sport in itself is exclusionary. So think a bit broader in terms of how you're going to get those groups that are perhaps othered and not the dominant group participating in some sort of physical activity. It doesn't have to be sport. When I was teaching, my philosophy was that I wanted all year 11s to leave me and do something. I don't care what they did. I don't care if they went to the gym, they played badminton, or if they decided they wanted to go and be, you know, an international hockey player. It didn't matter to me as long as that I prepared them in their life to do something, some sort of physical activity, some sort of exercise to keep them in healthy, active, with the potential benefits that has. So I think in terms of people going out into the workforce, just, you know, have that critical mindset of actually, I can make a difference, but sport can also be a negative, you know, vehicle for lots of things. So be aware of that and challenge when you get the opportunity to challenge. You are going to be very well educated, you're going to be developed as critical thinkers throughout your degree. You will meet people who aren't, who haven't read stuff, who aren't critical and just accept things for that they are the way they are and continue to do that cycle. So be prepared to use your position to challenge and use that position of power, if you like, as a vehicle for your own change.
So that was a yes then?
No.
Rachel and the rest of the panel, thank you very much for your opinion. I hope that everybody in the room, you're leaving with that challenge. I think it was a really nice one to say that whilst this isn't going to happen automatically, there is potential for you guys in the room to really make a difference, but you're going to have to work hard at it to make sport a really inclusive and powerful tool. But perhaps there is the potential there to do so. To Dave, Yozo, Rachel and Andy, we've got to finish there, we're over time. Thank you very much. Would you give them some...
You can't change the question again. Thank you, my friend. I had a whole script on Man City and been ownership. Oh God, that wasn't true. No, I didn't say such.
Very much. Thank you. Cheers, Nick. Cheers. Good job. Good job. Thank you. Thank you. Cheers, Andy.
Cheers. You're welcome. Hey, what a crew. Glad to do some support from the chairman.
The idealist versus the hard. We need idealists. Idealists. I'm just a hard case.
That's okay. We need us all. Thank you, chaps, ladies.
Until this week we haven't spoken, so
We'll chat together.
No, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Dom. Well chaired. Yeah, we can take it out.
If you look on Blackboard, there is numerous elements on there that you can be reading and organising yourself with. We're normally down in the arena, we would have been today, but this. Next week though, does anybody know where we are supposed to be? No. Anybody know where? Okay. So even though we're a week on, the module outline's been up for 2 weeks, and until Thursday, there's a good chance, it's one last chance for a bother. This should be read, it should be engaged with, it should be organised. In your third year, you actually have to wait. In 10 or 12 weeks' time, this module is going to be finished. So if you've lost a week because you haven't got the module outline, you haven't read the 3 readings, you haven't read